you very much. I thought, being the last speaker, I will have very little to say, but I find that I will have something to say because I'm going to cover a ground which is probably not being covered by the three very distinguished speakers. One reason I've chosen to cover this is because there, I believe, a lot of young students and some young teachers also there waiting to hear some of the ground realities. I'm saying that others have also spoken, but I'm going to speak about the farm economy and how the labor comes about and so on. And I'm going to discuss a little bit of that. And Professor Ovirup Sarkar actually started off by saying there are two types of people we are going to deal with, which is one is the normal residents, the other are the migrants. In fact, that's the right starting point. And I'm going to show that these two groups are very closely intertwined. Okay, and that is the narrative that I'm going to define here. And the other reason why I'm doing this is because I'm going to touch the ground of the areas like Orissa and parts of Bihar, parts of West Bengal, where a lot of socially deprived and poor people live, and they migrate and the work. And very correctly, it was said, observed, that capital, labor would follow capital, and that has been happening. And I think, if I've heard correctly, Professor Shoibalkar at the last instance, my view is going to be that at the moment there is no vaccine, there is no drug to cure. Hopefully, in a few months, there will be. And from past records that I have studied, I take the view that the migrants, most of them would return back to where they have come. And I have done studies about 20 years back to show that, and including the things that Prime Minister said about the Bhuj tragedy and super cyclone of Orissa, which took place about 2 decades back, and so on, and many other things from which I've done a huge study, 11 country study. I was a country leader for India about 20 years back, FAO study, and that was 11 countries, and we found that that has actually happened. So I assume there will be, at the end of the tunnel, there will be light. We will have a vaccine probably not too far away, maybe a year from now. But my position is that there is no scope, this is what I say, intertwined between the residents and migrants. So they will have to go back. There is no scope for them to be absorbed here. Now, since there are a lot of students and young teachers, I would like to get back to some of the basics, which I'm sure all the panelists know, which is about the three sectors and of the Indian economy, or for that matter, any other economy. The primary, the secondary, and the tertiary or the services sector. Just point out the fact, if some students and young teachers do not remember, that in India, it is an overwhelmingly large service sector. Okay, more than 60% of the GDP is actually originating from there. But this is not the kind of, Kuznets type of, post-industrial society service sector. This is a combination of a very heterogeneous services sectors, which is both government, corporate services, and financial services at the same time, farm, off farm, and many other services which are distress, based on distress earnings and so on. So today, to give a very rough outline picture, our total service sector is more than 60%. Our manufacturing sector, that is the secondary sector, manufacturing, mining, and so on, less than 25%. And agriculture, actually, the GDP originating in agriculture is only about 12 or 13%. But the dependence on the rural areas and agriculture is huge, about 50% or so. So how is this happening? It's a very low productivity. And that is what is happening. Now, one of the reasons what is happening is that uh, the typical farm size in India across the country, in places like Orissa, Bihar, and other places also very much so, but across the country, the average land's farm size is very, very low. It's just over 1 hectare, but nearly 40% of the farms are cultivated by, I mean, farm households, which are about 40%, they cultivate farm sizes which are just about 1 acre. And I think the modal value would probably be closer to half-acre than that. So together, the marginal and small farmers, they constitute more than 86% of the farms in India. We have to remember that. And they do not eke out a sufficient subsistence out of that. So today, a lot of the poverty has been removed in the country because they produce the farm products, of course, but they also combine that with a lot of other things. Today, cereals like rice, wheat, millets, and other things constitute a very small proportion of the total value of GDP produced in the country, in the farms. Okay. And milk, dairy products are a very, very important. As you know, India is the largest producer of milk and dairy products. They produce a lot of eggs, poultry, small ruminants, goats, and so on. So all these constitute part of the farm earnings, okay, of a typical household. And even that is not enough. So out of distress, they have off-farm things, off-farm productions, a little shop, a little pan ke dukan, chai, bidi, cigarette ke dukan, and little shops in the rural areas, urban areas. You go to any places, whether in Calcutta or Orissa or any of these towns, you see little shops. All these are part of off-farm, extra time. But even that is not good enough entirely because of the distress of the farmers of the small size, and the productivity is not high. So what happens is they cannot employ all the labor. It's typical old theory that we had of surplus labor. And today the surplus labor is not finding disguised unemployment. Okay. They are actually moving out, and they are mostly the people who go to towns and bigger cities, whether it is Calcutta from Orissa or from Calcutta to somewhere else, or they go to Gujarat, they go to Punjab, they go to Surat, in Gujarat, they go to, so many other towns in Delhi. For instance, if I give you the example of the Orissa migrants, for a long time they have been plumbers, and from there, a lot of the Odia plumbers. Okay, from plumbers, they have become electricians, fitters, and various other things. And from there, they moved into other things, a little bit education, a little bit of training, a little bit of skill. They work now all over the country in hospitality industries, like, let us say, in Bombay, Goa, and many other places. They work in farm sectors, they work in hospitals, hotels, restaurants. They work in all these capacities, low skilled workers, they work, all because they're coming out of the same place, the same farm economy, in which, if I have visited many parts of Orissa, Bihar, and Bengal, and a lot of the places you see in village India today, there are very few people, there are very few young men, they've all migrated. A lot of the feminization of agriculture that has taken place is precisely because there are no men, and a lot of the women with children, they stay at home, and the elderly people run the household, they run the farm economy, and children go to school, and the young men, young and middle-aged men, have all gone to the big towns to work. Okay, and that is the story of the intertwined markets of the migrants and the respondents. When we saw the Gauri pictures of the migrants returning home. This is a study that I had done, which is called by the FAO terminology, the buffer role of agriculture. Why are the migrants returning? And they have returned in the past, whether it is super cyclone in Orissa, or whether it is the Surat plague, or it is the Bhuj earthquake about which the Prime Minister talked, and Punjab terrorism, Delhi riots, the Godhra riots, and many other things that have happened place, uncertainty, crisis. And I have firm belief in the fact that these people have come temporarily. Today in Orissa, there are 5 lakh return migrants. And I can tell you, they are not going to stay back in Orissa. Their callings are different. So they are not only intertwined with the supply side, that is a farm economy, small farm economy from which they have gone, and they're very small, they cannot afford to absorb them back. Okay, and they've honed some skills in gems and jewelry industry, in as electricians, as other workers, hospitality, and so on and so forth. And they will, having honed those skills, they will go back, and the employers all want them back because they've trained them, they invested. But of course, we know very well, from the NCUS report of the late Arjun Sengupta, where he estimated that 93% of the laborers of the employed are in the unorganized sector. I mean, there have been disputes about the number. You can take 85, 90% of them. So they're very tenuous contracts and so on. And so this is the picture of the migrants. So they're very intertwined. They have to go back to Bombay, they have to go back to Delhi, they have to go back to Surat and all those things, but they're waiting for the time for that to come. I've taken down a few notes, but apart from these people, there are a huge number of landless laborers, or labor who have a little bit of land, but they're so tiny that they cannot cultivate. They actually do the reverse tenancy. They rent it out and they become. A lot of the scheduled castes and Dalits, other types of Dalits also are landless laborers, and they have been working in farm employment, and they also tend to migrate. So all these people will are affected in the lockdown. But let me just make a speculation. Uh, in the 3 sectors, the broad 3 sectors that we talked about, the service sector is very badly affected, and so is the manufacturing sector. But the government has come out with the reopening and certain loan schemes of the MSME sectors, about which some discussion had taken place just now. So they are okay. But I think the one good thing that has happened is, because of the nature of things, much of in my I surmise that the least affected sector of the Indian economy would be the farm sector, provided we get, and this is subject for discussion, of course, in the panel. And I think, uh, provided we have a reasonable monsoon, the farm sector would be relatively safe. By farm sector, I don't mean just the crop farming crop sector, but I also mean the eggs, the dairy, and the poultry, and various other things. It was very interesting when Bengal, all of you are from Calcutta, when Bengal opened up the sweet shops, people, talked and laughed about, in Bengal, sweet shops are getting opened because they can't do without shop. That's not really the reason. Derek O'Brien came on NDTV, and he said, which is very correct, saying that the huge amount of milk which is produced in the country, in the state, and they go waste, and we have seen that even in Orissa, they're throwing away milk. So they are dependent on milk, they're dependent on eggs, poultry, and various other things. and they are going to be relatively safe because they are part of the cottage industry, which is in the farm sector, and they're going to do reasonably well. The worst affected are the major manufacturing industry for the time being until they go back with the new arrangement. We don't know what's going to happen. They're opening up from today. I've seen on the television in the morning that many of these places are opening up. They're making arrangements. Even in Mumbai, they're opening. We talked about, somebody mentioned about the transport sector opening up. Best BEST transport is opening up in Mumbai. So that is definitely going to happen. All these are happening. Services sector very badly affected because a lot of the employment is in trade, construction, and transportation, and that is very, very badly going to be affected. But I think the other things which I would like to make a few observations is that apart from this, my surmise is that these migrants, that's one of the main points that I'm going to talk about, emphasize today in this webinar. These migrants do not have scope for absorption in the economies from which they have come. These are small farm sector, and in places from which they have gone, Orissa, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, and other places, they do not have either the scope for absorption or non-farm employment possibilities. So in order to hold up their income status, in order to continue with the skills that they've honed, they have to go back to their respective places. And I emphasize from the earlier studies about 2 decades back, they have gone back once the crisis is over, and they will go back, and the employers are looking forward to an opportunity for them to go. We are running short of time, but I'll wrap up. As the dean, I have a responsibility of not taking too much of your time. Uh, so that the intertwining of the two things, one is the place from which they have come. They have, while the farm sector is relatively stable, that is one reason they've come back, and they will be at least safe there in their home and hearths, but they don't have long term because all the extra income that they garner will not be possible for them to get, and they have no scope for being absorbed as surplus labor in these places. And so that is very important. Now, there are a couple of other points I would like to mention before we move on to something else, to the discussion. One is, uh, one of the reasons why I think poverty incidence is going to be hugely, increased in this period is partly because the income, of course, has gone down for everybody, but income of the poorest strata have gone down, partly because, what I said, the unorganized sector and their contracts. Immediately as the lockdown started, they lost their jobs because very well they cannot work from home. Those professions don't allow for working from home like you and I, but also because they have to come back, and they belong to the poorest section of the farm, and landless laborers, SCs who have no land to fall upon. So they are going to be affected, and landless laborers like this. So there will be both a very sharp increase in poverty in this period, as well as inequality. Inequality, I can predict, because again, the same thing, the lowest strata are going to lose their income. Therefore, if you have any measure of inequality, or inequality within poverty, which is the, say, FGT kind of measure, you will find that poverty, inequality, all these things will definitely increase. Uh, the income of the marginal farmers and small farmers will also decline, partly because of this. The other two macroeconomic issues which have already been touched upon, one of course has not been touched upon so much, but the macroeconomic issues, which is that the government has, the RBI and others have made a lot of announcements, uh, and this is again subject to discussion with the panel, have made announcements about, say, the monetary policy. You know, I for one believe that this is a typically Keynesian crisis. The scope for monetary policy is very, very limited. Of course, they will make a little dent in this moratorium and things like that to the NPA. They might do a little good things for, banks and NBFCs, but they're not going to change the mood. They're not going to provide animal spirits and so on. And on the other hand, what was required is a very, very strong fiscal policy intervention. Despite all the 5 consecutive sessions of the finance minister, I don't think neither economists nor the market was very convinced, that this is going to make a dent, despite the preface by the prime minister saying that, 10% of the GDP, it is that figure is being disputed whether it is going to be anywhere near 10% of GDP. It's not 20 lakh crore. It is probably going to be little more than 1% of GDP. But I hope the government will come back with that. So we will discuss many of these issues. These are very interesting issues to discuss. The efficacy of the monetary policy, the scope for fiscal policy in this, and also, some of the social effects that is part of the agenda of this, which is the poverty, inequality, the huge unemployment, particularly of the vulnerable sections, that is going to ensure. And only 5 kilo rice, of course, PDS has been ramped up. When I was in government, I was very much part of instrumental in government in vamping up the present method of public distribution system. I was myself very much part of it. And I know it has been ramped up from an absolutely non-existent PDS to a system which is now very, ravely reviewed as being very good system. I'm aware of that, but despite that, this is a crisis in which we need not just rice, 5 kilos of rice and 1 kilo of dal. We need a lot more of income transfers, And the other thing that is going to happen is migrants and various other things. What has happened, that's the last point I'm going to say. There are going to be social, discord problems because aspiration levels have hugely increased, okay, with the movement and mobility of people, which didn't exist about 3 decades back. So people have got a wind of how life is, how good life could be, and they're going to go back to these metro cities if they're not. And it's going to create, this is the socio-economic issues that we need to touch upon. It's going to be a lot of tensions if we don't solve this problem. And without a vaccine, without a drug coming up in the next few months, we have to live with it, but we have to be prepared for the social turmoil. And despite, quite apart from many of the economic issues. Okay, thank you very much, all the panelists and all the participants. But perhaps if Tanmoy agrees, we can have a quick discussion among the panelists before we move to the questions from the participants. Is that okay, Tanmoy?
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Ray, for your session. I will ask other distinguished panelists if they have any views to each other's argument. So kindly, we can move forward to this interaction between the panelists. That will be really good.
Yes.
So Professor Ray, Professor Sarkar, Professor Kaur, and Professor Majid, kindly give us your view. Thank you.
Tanmoy, you are muted.
Yeah. Sorry. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes. So I was just requesting that if we could have a panel discussion within the panelists. all the
but
distinguished panelists gave their own views. So, is there any thing we can come up with this view between discussing between the panelists? That's why I'm asking.
So let me, Tanmay.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
Tanmay, can I ask?
yeah, definitely, sir.
Okay, to the other
sure, sure,
panelists,
sure, sure,
you know,
sure.
from
Yeah,
the questions that I
definitely,
raised very quickly, if others have some views, I
definitely,
asked specifically whether, I mean, there is somebody, I think Shoival Kaur mentioned that they'll probably have a change of vocation. I do not think so. I think they are likely to go back to where they returned from after this crisis, which I called, or the FAO called the buffer role of agriculture. So that is one. And also possibly we can touch upon the efficacy of the monetary policy and the fiscal policy that has been announced. The adequacy of the fiscal policy and the efficacy of the monetary policy, and the question of whether you expect these people to, you know, return back to where they came from. I strongly believe that majority of them will return back. Any views on that from the other panelists?
Well, I might just chip in. Professor Ray, I did not talk about the change of vocation. So it's I basically talked
Sorry.
about two distinct trains and paths happening for the unskilled and the skilled
Okay. Sorry,
as a
sorry
result
about
of the
misunderstanding.
infrastructure, stock of infrastructure and the endowments of skilled and unskilled workers in certain places. No, but it's I think there are in some of the other participants have also put up this question as part of their as kind of discussion, that could you think of other ways to compensate for the loss of income that these people suffered essentially by trying to move back to their places of origin, and the states where they belong, not being sufficiently wealthy or farm based or endowed to keep them employed, as well as providing for them on a long term basis. Otherwise, in the first place, they wouldn't have moved out of their local areas and their known surroundings. So my point is, yeah, it's possible that either, so, and I've been trying to argue that in some other forums perhaps, is that some kind of unemployment insurance, if that's agreeable to the government through certain subsidies, and then the government would actually have to could actually get rid of the financial packages that go for maintaining the livelihood of relocated workers. If the government had some plans before to initiate some unemployment insurance by which the workers could stay wherever they are, and the insurance would kick in once such crisis happens. This is usually possible for most labor market scenarios in advanced locations. We have problems in terms of, like you mentioned, with the unorganized sector. Professor Marjit and I have worked extensively on several aspects of the unorganized workforce in India, and we find that these are certain issues that remain under the table whenever it comes to the government policy, whenever it comes to discussions by certain policymakers. These are simply not touched upon, despite the fact that it becomes so compelling when a crisis like this happens.
You know, absolutely correct. I mean, the problem with this pandemic or the COVID crisis is other crises have come as a singular thing. And this crisis has come nationwide, internationally, everywhere. You can't run away from anywhere, you know, everywhere. And that's the problem. You know, other things that I said, you know, they have come in single episodes, plague somewhere, terrorism somewhere, you come home and you go back. But here it's a worldwide phenomenon. Unless vaccine is the way and the drugs are the way, we can't really solve this problem. But till then, we really have to see how. Yes, absolutely correct. We really have to go back to social security, but the problem with social security is that you have to generate a counter strategy, which is that in all social security, I mean, countries, welfare states, they have either taxes or they have contributions to social security, right? Which generate that. You cannot fiscally just keep on subsidizing people. So you have to raise, I mean, if you go to the Scandinavian countries, they have huge taxes, but they can depend upon that. If you go to UK and other places, you find people are getting, but that's part of either contribution you are making yourself or a combination of that and taxes. But suddenly we can't have that. But we really have to devise something, but it requires a change of ideology of the government, you know.
Sir,
But
can I interrupt a little bit? I
yeah.
mean, actually, we are running out of time, and we have a lot of questions are coming from the participants.
Okay, Tonmay, I suggest we can stop after some time if you want, after panelists say, but you can extend it by 15 minutes if you want. Can
Okay,
you
okay,
not?
yeah, obviously. I'm
Not 5:30, but 5:45, 5:50, you can extend it.
Yeah, I'm requesting or asking the other panelists if they have their views.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we'll move towards the question and answer phase.
Yes.
I have
I think
just
Professor Sarkar has some. Yes, sir. Sir.
I
Yeah,
am
I have two comments basically.
Definitely.
One about what Sugata was saying. That's very interesting. Um, will Sugata agree with me if I say that because of this pandemic, because of labor becoming infected, could there be a long-term tendency of capital substituting labor? That is, could there be a technical progress or technical change, let's say, which will substitute labor by capital? As it is, we are having jobless growth. So this pandemic might lead to further joblessness. That is my question to Sugata. And to Professor Ray, uh, you see, you said monetary policy might not work. I think monetary policy will not work as far as demand, boosting up of demand is concerned. However, if you consider the banking sector, they are going to face a very serious crisis because if a lot of people are going to default at the same time because their flow of income is going to stop, then the banking sector will be in a serious crisis, and the RBI or the central bank has to do something about it.
No, no,
So I think
that I totally, Professor Sarkar, I totally concede that NPAs would be taken care of, but reducing the repo rate was entirely unnecessary. Repo
no,
rate
no, I agree with you there. Reducing interest rates never boosts up demand; it increases profits. I think economists understand that, but there is a lot of pressure from the industry, from the corporate sector to reduce interest rates because
yeah.
it simply increases profits. That's
Yeah, moratorium, accommodative policy, I can understand because of the NPA reason. You know, that definitely
yeah,
for both
okay.
banking sector as well as NBFCs, you know, that is granted. I agree entirely with you. Yeah.
I think what I'm trying to say is exactly
Can't hear you.
prediction. Oh, sorry. What I am trying to say is exactly what Professor Sarkar has preempted. He has said that there is a long-term replacement of labor by capital. There is a tendency because anyway we see automation and so on. In fact, there is a new coinage of technological change. It's called labor eliminating technological progress. Usually we talk about labor neutral or Higgs neutral or biased technological change, but now it is almost like that automation is kind of labor eliminating technological change, and I think that at least for a period of time, if people would be the producers would try to do that because of, and this is a problem for India and countries like India because it's not really that much of a problem for countries where wage rates is already very high, but for countries where wage rates are low, and it goes back to our problem of development economics in 60s and 70s on inappropriateness of technology. The technology that we use is not appropriate for our country. One just little point I should talk about the monetary policy. I think just as a sort of intrusion into Virup Sarkar and Shovan Ray's comments is the idea that when the government spends by printing money, the deficit financing is also a very, very Keynesian way of doing things. So the question here, repo rate again, by reducing interest rate, I don't know what kind of benefits that gives to the nation. But what I believe is that if the government goes on borrowing to spend more, because we know that in any problem of Keynesian system, any kind of recession, any kind of slowdown, the government has a big role to play. Either it has to redistribute income from the low marginal propensity consume to high marginal propensity consume group, or the government has to spend on its own. Whatever government wants to do, the resources in this case is very realistic, because the government's earning has fallen. The government does not have money to spend. So what do you do? In that case, I think very class book, and very textbook kind of, training in terms of saying that if you could actually increase supply of money and spending, fiscal spending at the same time, somehow you do not pressurize the interest rates. Because if you do that, then if you cannot do that, then interest rates will go up. But that, I think, is a theoretical sort of point, which tells you that basically government spending by printing new money is a very justified policy in this setup. But of course, I completely agree with both of you that rate of decline in the rate of interest is ultimately increasing the profits. Basically, because there are so many papers and so many works which says that reduction of interest rate does not increase aggregate investment demand and so on. So I agree, but with that kind of caveat. Thank you very much.
Sir, can we then move forward to the question and answer? Is it fine?
Yeah.
So here is Professor Pipin. He is the Dean of the Xavier School of Rural Management of Xavier University, Bhubaneswar, and he has some questions to the panelists. So, Professor Pipin, you may go.
First of all, I would like to congratulate Professor Ray and his team for organizing this excellent webinar. It was very interesting and exciting to listen to four eminent economists that our country is blessed with, including Professor Ray. So thank you very much for inviting us. I am a little puzzled about a few things that is happening in our country today. I am not an economist, so please pardon me if I make any mistakes in asking the following few questions. Number one is, 10% of the population holds 77% of the national wealth. So therefore, my first question is, what is Indian in Indian economy? Okay, so we are all talking about migrant workers, the farm economy, agricultural economy, these are all fine. But ultimately, it is the 10% of the people in our country who call the shots. So therefore, what is Indian in Indian economy? That is number one. Number two is, whatever little report and information that we have been reading now, the number of billionaires in India and in the world, they continue to increase their wealth even in COVID situation. That's the reality. If you look at the stock market, there is no major collapse in the stock exchange, right? So this is another puzzling factor for me. So I would like to be enlightened by the eminent thinkers here. Thank you.
What is that 10% you mentioned, Pepin? What is that?
10% of the Indian population is owning 77% of the national wealth.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the latest Oxfam report on inequality. I mean,
that is true worldwide. I mean, that is a serious concern to which this panel, I don't expect to have an answer to that, because that's a long-term this thing, which has been going on, and the
so therefore, what is Indian economy then? Let us call it economy of these 10 people, right? Why do you call it Indian economy?
No, you can talk about, if you look at it from that perspective, yes. But, that secular tendency, which is the reversal of what Kuznets talked about, which has been proved to be flawed, that Kuznets inverted U-shape doesn't work. Now, this study, what is that famous French economist, his study shows very clearly that it is, if anything, it is a normal U curve that it has gone down in the around the middle of the 20th century. It is now creeping up and it is going to go up more and more. So that is a secular tendency happening everywhere. He has shown. That name escapes me. The famous man, the French economist. Anyway, so that is something. But then, Professor Pepin, we have to discuss this irrespective of the secular tendency. We have to discuss the immediate problem and the proximate reasons and possible policy issues emanating from the COVID-19 pandemic. We really have to work for it, because otherwise the worst affected people are the poorest of the lot. So that tendency that you mentioned would get aggravated. Poverty would increase even more. Inequality would sharpen even more. If we can't protect, at least to some extent, from the fallout of this kind of a tragedy, even if you couldn't give that, even that 5 kilo rice and 1 kilo dal and that 500 rupees that the government has given, even that would not be coming. Yes, Professor Sharkar, I think, or
I have,
Chukatamaji
I have,
mentioned
I
that
have a
there is a
remark on
propensity to
Professor
save,
Pipik's
probably
opening
he
chair.
mentioned. But that apart, you don't even have the cushion then. We have to live with certain realities, but I agree, your point, your observation is absolutely correct. But then we also have to intervene in the short run to see to what extent we can cushion the worst affected people. That would
I
be
think, I
my
think,
response, but then other panelists can.
Yes, Professor Ajit,
I think Professor Marjit has something to say. Yes,
Yeah.
Professor Marjit.
Yes, just a reaction and extension reaction to Professor Pipik's comment and question, and an extension of Professor Roy's remark. I think couple of things we have to be very clear. First of all, that yes, India really is one of the worst performers so far as the wealth inequality is concerned. True that if you look at the country and say that only 10% of people command so much of wealth, what has happened to this country? And that is, I think, a very, very, very reasonable question that Professor Pipik is asking. But I just would like to mention a few things that in 1950s, India's rate of poverty was around more than 60%, or maybe even before independence, you can go to phases where it was more than 60% in many places. The question is that now, even with so much of debate, we still agree that the rate of poverty has gone down substantially. Number one. Number two, the fact that here, not only those 10% of people, they decide the political fate of this country. This is a large democratic country, so every person has a vote. That means that's why you find that the government of India, whoever there is in power, governments in the state, whoever is in the power, they cannot ignore the affairs of the poor people. They have to, that's why Norega has come about. That's why bank nationalization has come about. That's why so many things have come about. So while it is really a pain, it's really an agony that we have to live with. But as Professor Ray has mentioned, that we still have to steer, ahead with the idea that actually the citizens of this country must not suffer due to this kind of disaster. So the question, I think, is that India should have done much better. It could not. But that does not say that India has not done anything at all. Because if you look at our country, 50 years, 80 years in the past and now, you would see people's aspirations have increased. It's not that people are stuck at a particular position. So I think that if you look at the access to education, access to public inputs, and if you remember, if you just take an estimate, very rough estimate, provision of public inputs, provision of public good, just 50 years ago, just 60 years ago, you will find that the relative access must have improved in favor of the poor people. So there are certain, I think, achievements, but at the same time, these guys are most affected when this kind of natural disaster kicks in. So that's why Professor Rice is repeatedly saying that actually secular movements, we cannot do much, and our history, our activities, our politics is such that we can blame. But the point is, the reality says that we have to protect those guys, who are, let's say, bottom 30%, bottom 40%, because now their income is zero, almost zero. So in that way, I think that's the relevance of economic policy making in a very unequal world. So you also look at the positive sides of our achievements to some extent.
Thank you, Professor Marjit. So we have a next question from Bishan Shannal. So if he is available in this, Bishan, yeah, he is available. Hello. Hello. Yeah.
So Tanmay, you asked the question.
Yeah, he is here. He is here. Yeah, Mr. Bishan, you can ask
Yes.
your queries to the panelists. Yeah.
My question is, as the government is compelled to lock down the economy, stop production, we know from the concept of MEC that people take loan to produce. But whoever has taken loan, especially MSMEs and small agriculture producers, they cannot produce due to the announcement. So why moratorium? Why not it is interest waiver? At least for the MSMEs and small agricultural producers.
Who is going to answer?
Group sir, you want?
Who is going to respond to that?
Yes, Professor Sarkar can respond.
My preference would certainly be for a waiver, but the question is whether the government is in a position to bear such a burden. Someone has to bear the burden, and this is number one. And number two, there could be some units who are actually able to pay, and they will not pay. Even those who are in a position to pay, will take this opportunity of not paying. So now there is I'm sure I completely agree with you that a 6-month moratorium will basically add up to the load of the person who has taken the loan. But then if it's a straight off moratorium to everyone,
Not for everyone. Not for everyone. Like poverty line, we can demarcate it. We can demarcate it.
See, one problem is that.
Yes.
So if we are talking about fairness, right? Suppose we talk about units which are small and we give waiver to them, right? That's fine. But just consider those units which are unregistered and which cannot be, are not recorded, for example. There are hundreds and thousands of them who are taking loans from the local money lender, right? So shouldn't the government do something about them? I mean, why should the entire, package be geared towards those who are registered? So there are problems, there are problems of distribution. It's waiver. I am in favor of waiver in many cases, but one has to be very, very careful as far as waiver is concerned. And waiver should come as a last resort, as in the case of agriculture, also in the case of industry. That's my opinion. Anyway, other panelists might have other views.
Thank you very much. Just I want to ask our panelists if they have a time to answer only 2 questions, and they are very junior students. So can I move forward?
Well, I am prepared to sit for longer time. I am prepared to sit for longer time.
Yeah, obviously.
But ask others.
Yeah. Also others. So this is one of our student. He's a 3rd year student, and she already got her gave the final semester. So Kavya, why don't you ask the question directly to the respected panelists? Hello. Okay, she is there. Yeah. Kavya, you unmute yourself.
Yes.
Hello.
Yeah,
Yes,
you are
Bhubaneswar.
audible.
Good evening to all the my question like of course the pandemic has a very direct health impact on the affecting the COVID patients, but I would like to know the comments about how it is indirectly affecting the health of the economy, like the informal sector which is suffering from starvation and everything, and also there is reduced health access to the newborn babies or the mothers, or even I read a case that the primary health workers of the country are presently working for the COVID pandemic situation. So they are not able to cater to the vaccine requirement of the country, and many of the polio vaccinations which should have taken place during this time have not taken place, so it may have long run health impacts on the lives of the people of the economy. So I just wanted to know how all these would have how all these would affect the social and the psychological well-being of the labor force, and hence the productivity of the labor force in the long run.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so who answers? Maybe I can just chip in with a few points.
Yes, sir.
Is that
Yes, sir.
okay?
Definitely. Definitely, sir.
Well, you see, Kavya, this was probably expected, and that's the reason the lockdown happened in the first place. You see, our resources are never enough, even in the regular times. And during a crisis like this, when everybody might potentially get affected and fall sick, depending on the degree of seriousness that they're exposed to, the hospital system, the number of doctors and medical care professionals we have in the country, or perhaps in any country of the world, is completely, insufficient to cater to a mass influx of patients in the hospital system, right? So once this epidemic or pandemic happens, then people are trying to actually take care of the more exigent or more urgent needs of the according to the crisis, keeping aside all regular issues, including mental health, including catering to babies. And I also hear, I similarly reflect like you, that cancer patients are not probably getting their treatments from time to time. There are other serious patients who are deferring their visits to the doctors and to the hospital just because it simply would not accommodate the additional pressure of looking at regular patients apart from those who are affected by the COVID thing. Now, this is something which is probably linked to what I was also trying to tell you, that number one, you see, human capital doesn't get formed overnight. So training of doctors, nurses, and healthcare professionals would take time. And it would also depend strictly on the amount of infrastructure that's available in particular region, right? So for example, the southern states, perhaps, which is already quite endowed with the hospital facilities, a much better facility compared to the rest of the country, can handle the crisis better compared to some other states where the hospital facility, the number of doctors, the number of trained professionals are relatively less. So the question is how quickly we adjust the infrastructure and the human capital, and as a response to a crisis, can we really gear up to make some kind of a parity across regions, so that there is a possibility of spreading out the pressure of additional loads in times like this much more equitably across places, and relying on the local support and local support system to cater to patients apart from those affected by the pandemic. And that would have actually not required the lockdown to happen in the first place. If we had enough medical resources to be supplied to people, then lockdown was absolutely unnecessary.